Hey guys, it's me, Gavin, and this is Apollo Justice, protagonist of the Apollo Justice Ace Attorney Trilogy. Except, he really isn't, is he? Here, I've made a handy chart to outline who gets attention in each Ace Attorney game. If you look over at the original trilogy, you'll see that Phoenix takes an overwhelming majority of the attention, being playable in 12 out of the total 14 cases and having a major role in 13. Now, let's take a look at Apollo's Trilogy. Apollo is playable in 8 out of the total 14 cases and has a major role in 9, and that's counting every case where you only partially play as Apollo. In his titular game, you play solely as Apollo for the first 3 cases, but then go half and half with Phoenix in the last case due to the flashback and Mason system. In Dual Destinies, you play solely as Apollo for 2 cases, but one of them is only a single-day trial. In Spirit of Justice, you play solely as Apollo for 1 case and then go half with Phoenix again. If we were to split the half cases in 2, then you only play as Apollo for 7 out of 14 cases. Even if I do the same thing to Phoenix in the original trilogy due to the time you play as Edgeworth, Phoenix still gets played for 11.5 out of 14 cases. So what does this tell us? Well, quite simply, that the Apollo Justice Trilogy is a misnomer. It would be more accurate to call this the Ace Attorney Trilogy featuring Apollo Justice. But, despite the fact that Apollo doesn't get a lot of attention in his trilogy, he still gets some amazing cases that really show off the greatness of his character and the heights this series can reach, is what I would say if I was a lawyer. Starting with Apollo Justice, the mainline games just don't hit the same as the previous ones. Some might say that's because Shu Takumi took a backseat and then eventually left, and while that might be true, Takumi also wrote Turnabout Big Top and Turnabout Sisters and The Great Ace Attorney, so he can suck my balls. Ace Attorney has never been totally allergic to bad cases, but the Neo Trilogy is pretty consistent with how mid or bad these cases are. And yes, I'm sticking with calling it the Neo Trilogy. We've already established that the Apollo Justice Trilogy is inaccurate, and saying Neo instead of New makes my rocks hard, so we're gonna go with that. Because these cases are so particularly bad, this puts a greater focus on the characters, but in the case of our protagonist, this turns out to be woefully untrue. Calling this the Apollo Justice Trilogy was either a mistake or a lie, or sheer ineptitude. This video is mostly going to be about how misused Apollo was across the games and how this trilogy failed the character it was fucking named after. Ace Attorney 4 actually starts off pretty fantastically with Turnabout Trump. I have problems with the trial itself, and it's a bit long in the tooth for an intro trial, but as an introduction to Apollo and a reintroduction to Phoenix, this really hits it out of the park. Right off the bat, Apollo was a very different person from who Phoenix was in his first game. He's more hot-headed and energetic, blowing out his own voice from practicing earlier that day, implying that he might feel he has to prove himself more to his mentor, Gavin.
No relation.
Unfortunately, in terms of character writing, Apollo doesn't get quite as much as Phoenix did, and that's because Kristoff's relationship is more established with Phoenix than with Apollo, and you really start to see that towards the end of the trial. For comparison, the defendant in Phoenix's first trial was one of his best friends. Part of why the case is so easy is because Phoenix knows Larry and finds it easy to believe in his innocence. Plus, the connection to Larry can do some of the heavy lifting when it comes to establishing Phoenix's history and character. The defendant in Apollo's first case is Phoenix himself, and despite it being intriguing to see Phoenix fallen from grace, Apollo himself doesn't have any connection to Phoenix. This then means that Apollo has to establish his character through the story itself, but that doesn't happen. The trial ends, Kristoff is arrested, and Apollo is left completely baffled. But Apollo ends the trial in a very interesting place. He doesn't trust Phoenix. Some might assume the natural progression of the story to be that Apollo leaves Kristoff's office and joins up with his new hero, Phoenix, but that isn't the case. Apollo finds himself lost after the intro trial. He can't get jobs and finds himself reluctantly coming to Phoenix's office, hoping to find out more about this legendary attorney and how he could have possibly fallen from grace. Apollo not getting much to do in his intro trial is the point. He's a small pawn in the grand scheme of things. In a well-written story, this is the point where the character in question would grow past what they are and become a more significant force in the story. And then Turnabout Corner starts. The problem with Turnabout Corner isn't that it's a bad case or anything, it's actually fairly decent. The problem is that it's a bog standard Ace Attorney case that comes directly after the entire status quo of the series has changed. The second cases in Ace Attorney games almost universally serve the same purpose: give some establishment to the world, tutorialize the investigation segment, and keep things simple. This is inherently incongruent with what Ace Attorney 4 needs to do. The beginning of Turnabout Corner is the kind of beginning that I feel like someone would come up with if they were trying to parody an Ace Attorney story. It begins with Apollo meaning to squeeze the hell out of Phoenix about the past 7 years, but the first thing that happens is Phoenix kicking Apollo out to go do a bunch of inane bullshit. And it's not like Apollo gets nothing to do, but a lot of this case is spent getting to know the relevant characters and setting up Apollo's dynamic with Trucy. Apollo himself is woefully left out of the character building, typically being relegated to feeling bewildered or despondent to the goings-on and eccentricities of the various characters, like Eldoon, or Waki, or Emma. Yeah, Ace Attorney 4 features the return of Emma Skye from the first game's remake, But since that case wasn't seen by anyone who played the GBA original, Emma needs to be heavily reintroduced to the audience with her new job, her new quirks, and her entirely new personality. Criticizing Emma's insane character turn is a video for a different day. For right now, the point is that we spend so much time discovering our new detective, we don't get any time for Apollo. All of this combined means that Apollo doesn't really get much to do in the first investigation of his titular game. Remember what Phoenix did in his second trial? Reconciling with the death of his mentor, becoming protective of her sister, having to defend himself in the trial, going at it with his rival and childhood friend as the prosecutor? You get the gist. But the investigation isn't everything, and the trial is where an attorney really shows their stuff against a brutal and calculating prosecutor. Klavier is not that prosecutor. Yeah, this is Klavier Gavin, our new prosecutor. Introducing a new prosecutor makes sense. Apollo doesn't have any connection to Phoenix's rivals, and though Edgeworth would have been an interesting perspective on Phoenix's fall, we find out in the next game that Edgeworth was in it the whole time, so who knows how much his presence here would have been worth. However, Klavier is still a massive fumble. For one, he's certainly no Miles to Apollo's Phoenix. Not just because he effectively disappears after this game, but because he has absolutely no connection to Apollo. The only thread between the two is that Kristoff was Apollo's mentor and Klavier's brother, but like I said before, we know nothing about the relationship between Apollo and Kristoff, and the game reveals nothing about the relationship between Klavier and Kristoff. Despite this, we must still spend time building Klavier up as a character since we'll be facing him throughout the game, but this still isn't used to Apollo's benefit. Edgeworth connected to Phoenix's childhood and ideals, and the two spent the game clashing despite their camaraderie. Franziska resented Phoenix for his accomplishments, stewing over Phoenix's every decision because she couldn't believe he was the man who had bested her hero. And Godot was intricately tied to Phoenix's past, even if Phoenix didn't know it, pushing him to his absolute limit to test the lawyer that Mia believed in so much. Klavier calls Apollo Air Forehead and plays an air guitar. I really don't want to downplay Klavier's character because he is an entertaining guy, but when Apollo is so starved of character development, you really start to feel the hours waste away. Even in the third case, where Klavier takes on a less adversarial role, the opportunity still isn't used to connect Klavier to Apollo in any way, despite the fact that we go directly to his fucking office. For a bit of perspective, we didn't get to Edgeworth's office in Ace Attorney 1 until the 5th case, and that case wasn't even in the original version of the game. Back to Ace Attorney 4, by the time we reach the 4th case, we aren't even focusing on Apollo and Klavier, since we flash back to Phoenix versus Klavier. Speaking of which, this is how we find out what happened to Phoenix 7 years ago. Remember when Apollo was interested in this information? Well, in an act of cosmic comedy, this information is never shared with Apollo as far as the player is aware. The one point of praise that I might have given to the game's mystery early on isn't shared with the protagonist who desired it. Apollo may be a vessel for the player, but this doesn't work the other way around. Just because you tell the player this info doesn't mean that Apollo is free and clear to just continue the case as normal. To top it all off, the jury and Mason systems are used in a big fuck-off endgame reveal that involves Trucy's long and storied history. Oh, and Lemirar is Apollo and Trucy's mom. I wish I could say this affects anything, but neither Apollo nor Trucy ever learn this. It's only revealed so that the player can make epic surprise faces. Honestly, this is a pretty pointless fact in the grand scheme of things. Apollo being Trucy's brother never comes up again. But the point I'm trying to make is that we now have to throw Trucy's backstory onto everything else 4 needs to do. If you haven't caught on to a problem by now, let me spell it out for you. Ace Attorney 4 has a lot it needs to get done, and unfortunately, Apollo absolutely gets the short end of the stick. Between all the characters and plot points you either have to establish or re-establish, and the lack of focus on Apollo's character in the story, we're left with a game that's titled Apollo Justice, but is barely even about him. But you know what? Apollo's first game doesn't necessarily have to focus super hard on him. This is Ace Attorney's first attempt at trying to set up a new lead, so hopefully the next game will finally take its time with fleshing out Apollo and giving him the attention he deserves. Oh hi Athena. I don't dislike Athena, in fact I'm pretty lukewarm towards her in general, but her introduction to the series is one of the biggest mistakes ever made by the games, especially for Apollo. Apollo is already pretty stretched for time when it comes to establishment due to the nature of 4's beginning and end, so the absolute last thing he needed was to be sharing breathing room with a completely new character, which isn't at all helped by the fact that Phoenix is back as the protagonist of the series, reintroducing himself as a lawyer and taking the lead in the first and last cases of the game. So where does this leave Apollo? Well, he gets knocked out and leaves Phoenix's office in the first trial, off to a great start. He gets to do the second case of the game, which I've already established are pretty commonly simple, and he gets the second to last case, which is exclusively a trial section, and not a particularly long one at that. And he does actually get details about his past in that second to last case, but they're not exactly helpful in fleshing out Apollo as a member of this universe. As I pointed out at the beginning of this video, Apollo gets one case in which he isn't playable where he gets a major role, which is the last case of Dual Destinies. However, calling what Apollo does in that game's last case a major role is me massively overselling just how important Apollo is. In the second to last last trial, it's revealed that the victim of the crime is Apollo's best friend from his high school years, a character that was completely unknown prior to this very trial, despite giving Apollo his signature catchphrase. We see Apollo become a little more serious during the trial, but considering that everything we know about Apollo's friend is retrospective, this info doesn't actually change much about Apollo's character. Explaining a character's past is supposed to change the audience's view of that character, but Apollo doesn't really get anything outside of "he was my friend." Luckily, we can get so much more from him by seeing how he changes after his friend's death. God damn it. Yeah, the second to last trial is actually a prequel to the game's first trial, where Apollo gets knocked out and leaves the story to Phoenix and Athena. Then, in the last case, Apollo shows up for a little while just to go, "Yeah, I'm still here technically," and then fucks off again, only to make a full reappearance during the trial. And then, as if granted a miracle by the gods, Apollo finally gets some proper character development. The reason he's been wearing an eye patch for the whole trial isn't because he was injured, it's because he was stuck between what he was seeing and what he was believing. Apollo fucks off for the last case because he couldn't bring himself to face Phoenix and Athena while not trusting in Athena's innocence, and giving us insight into how Apollo is trying to take Phoenix's lesson about being an attorney to heart. It's honestly pretty great, but that's all it is. This one moment, this one aspect of Apollo's character, that's pretty much all we get throughout this entire game. You know who really gets a deep dive in this case? Athena. You know who's connected to this game's prosecutor? Athena. Despite the fact that Apollo was actually the first one to face Blackwill, you know who's connected to the last case's criminal? Athena. Apollo is a side story at best when it comes to dual destinies, which obviously doesn't bode very well for his trilogy. They even give Athena her own case in the next game, despite the fact that it means Apollo only gets 2 for himself, and the fact that Athena's case is essentially filler. There's not even an investigation segment. And the worst part of everything? Ace Attorney's Spirit of Justice repeats a mistake Dual Destinies made in the exact same way.
I'm the world's best backwards driver. Just watch this right here, lover boy.
What are you doing? Watch out, look out!
You might have noticed it from how I described Apollo's past in 4 and Dual Destinies, but it's time to elaborate on this problem here. Apollo rarely ever gets development that establishes him in the world because his story is constantly being written in reverse. The one thing we find out about Apollo's past in 4 is that Trucy is his sister, which never matters and can barely even be considered a part of Apollo's past. The major contribution to Apollo's story in Dual Destinies is a character we had zero idea about prior to the trial, and who only exists to explain parts of Apollo's backstory that are wholly unimportant to the details of his character. Apollo's catchphrase is impactful because it's how he displays his own eagerness in the face of inexperience. Who the catchphrase came from means nothing, and actually has the potential to lessen the impact it has on Apollo's character. This continues in Spirit of Justice, where we find out Apollo was actually from Courtroom, and his dad is a revolutionary, but his birth father was a musician. The main prosecutor is his adoptive brother? Yeah, Spirit of Justice continues the trend of adding superfluous details to Apollo's story with zero setup, instead of just giving him anything to progress forward with. Let's go one at a time. Apollo being from Courtroom. Apollo has no spiritual powers, even if the bracelet is basically magic, and he's never seemed to be out of place in the culture of Ace Attorney's world. He's actually one of the more grounded characters as detailed in the 4th game. So what does being from Courtroom actually change? Well, jack shit. What about Apollo's father? We find out who his mom is in the 1st game, but never the dad. Well, Dirk is actually a pretty interesting character, and he even brings out the more sarcastic and belligerent side of Apollo due to his feelings towards Dirk, so he does his job pretty well. I can't say the same about Apollo's birth father though, who died before Apollo even knew him, and is only important in that his existence is used as evidence in the last case, so Apollo's birth father could have been Dirk and really nothing would change. And then there's Sadmati. If Klavier was disappointing, Sadmati is downright wasteful. Like I said, I didn't like downplaying Klavier because there are things to like about him. But Sadmati spends the entire game putting up this condescending monk front that gets old by his 2nd appearance. I compare it to Franziska's whip from the 2nd game, but at least there she had story relevance and good dialogue to balance out her annoying traits. Sadmati might be the most useless prosecutor to date. He spends most of the game just being a general nuisance and not really doing much of note. But then it's revealed in the final case that he's also Dirk's son, and therefore Apollo's brother. Yet this has absolutely no bearing on any of Apollo's actions throughout the game, despite the fact that Apollo was actually the first one to face Sadmati. Sadmati is the absolute worst case of writing Apollo backwards, since unlike Dirk, and unlike what Dual Destinies tried to do, knowing that the two are brothers means basically nothing other than to add to a list of bullet points on a wiki. And then finally, when all's said and done, when we're finally done writing Apollo's story in reverse, when we're finally at the end of this Apollo Justice trilogy, you know what happens? Apollo's done. He leaves the Ace Attorney cast and might not ever be coming back. Of course, in a hypothetical Ace Attorney 7, that might not be the case. For all we know, the series could finally go back to calling itself Apollo Justice Ace Attorney and take place entirely within Courtroom. But until then, Spirit of Justice has left us in a position where it seems like our new protagonist was a fad at best and a distraction at worst. Let it be known that I only make this video because I like Apollo a lot. He's one of, if not my favorite character in the series. I like his personality, I like his character design, I like his animations, and I think he fits perfectly well as a protagonist for the series. But I can't accept a title built on a throne of lies. I wish I could say with full confidence that this is Apollo's trilogy, that he truly got everything he deserved and flourished, but I can't say that. So when I see a title that so blatantly lies to me, I can really only think of one thing to say. Nero did it better. Oh, and also...
Objection!